The Shield Maiden. The Shield Maiden stood peaceful but fierce above the tender. She spoke. What is the call of the Absolute? The tender replied. It is the call to oneness. The Shield Maiden spoke. How is oneness felt? The tender replied. It is felt through nature. The Shield Maiden spoke. How is it felt in nature? The tender replied. Nature allows life. It expresses its own infinite voice through manifestation to the extent it may, but nature then calls all life back to itself. The wolves surround the lonely traveller. He considers his flesh and the structure of his bone. Nature wishes for it back, always to repurpose. Forests feed on flesh and bone. Plants feed on flesh and bone. Animals feed on flesh and bone. The plant and the animal must die for the forest to live. The desire for flesh and bone is the need of nature to consume what it has made, its own body. All that grows is reached upon by nature. The will of nature, despite itself, is for oneness. Thus the vine grasps, thus the wolf hunts, thus the insect that sucks the blood, thus the bacteria that infects the wound, thus the soil is broken down and replenished by worms. All exists to consume life, to return it to oneness. All that grows is the expression of nature, a part of nature, its body, and the reach of its will. All that grows expresses what it may and does its duty to consume. The recognition of oneness as the creative element is thus the recognition of death. Death is the closest path to a return to oneness. To crave oneness is to crave death. To crave death is to recognize nature's will, to return all to the soil. And the body that has done its duty brings most. The stronger may live from the stronger that died. The soil represents oneness. The wolf feeds on flesh that fed on animal and on plant. The wolf craves to live so that it may kill. The wolf is a servant of death. The wolf lives to return all to oneness. The wolf will starve if he must in the doing of his duty. He will go lean so long as he may live long enough to kill again, so to return more to the soil, so that more may grow, so that more may die, so that the soil might more resemble oneness. The Shield Maiden spoke. What is the soil that resembles oneness? The tender replied. It is the soil that is rich, the soil that is enough in its own body to feed the greatest extent of life. The soil is the manifestation of the universe. To wish for the universe is to wish for the soil, but to become the soil, death must be embraced. The Shield Maiden spoke. How is death embraced? The tender replied. In the killing and in the culling, and those even of the self when strongest. Death is embraced in the giving of the self, and in the giving of plant and animal. The wolf kills so to live. The wolf wins his life by cheating death of himself, by making death wait. But the wolf is death's servant. He pays for his life. He delays his own honor by feeding death's honor. The wolf would kill all before he himself would die. The wolf would give all to death. The wolf knows death's will is for all to be one. That is his love for death. The Shield Maiden spoke. Why is death shunned? The tender replied. Life is the expression of the extent of oneness. The expression must shun oneness if it is to live. The expression is life. Life is the diverse expression of the soil. Life represents the extent of the soil from which it grows. Thus life in infancy rebels in its emanation against its parent. The Shield Maiden spoke. This is the story of One Eye and the she-wolf. There are 3 parts for you to discern. The old wolf, grey-bristled with bloodthirsty pack, watched the blood-stained she-wolf. Above others she stood, further than others she saw, most beautiful of all she grew. She looked at the scarred face of the pack-father, into his one remaining eye. She could feel his still strong shimmering of muscle. She knew his will. She was to entice, so that the pack would feed, and so that the prey would weaken. Downwind, the pack spread through the forest, and the old one watched. The man kept close his powerful guarding dog, but the man eventually would sleep. Silent, in light youth she stalked the camp, panting only so the dog would hear. The Old One knew the dog would seek her. He knew its blood would crave her. He knew it would not suffer to be stopped by the now sleeping man. The dog in silence would watch as she, with her form between the trees, with the sound of her breath, split the leather. And then freed he would run, by scent of the snow track alone, until he caught her. But she was long-legged and powerful of body. She was faster, more agile, and in the clearing she sat, in the clearing she waited and watched. Her coat, white, grey-bristled, blood-marked, shimmered with the silver under the moon. The dog arrived and slowly approached, and she allowed him. She did not yet kill. She retreated, coyly as he closed. She would tell him to trust her by causing him to forget that he should not. He would follow, lusting for her, or else forgotten, only the marking of her blood set in his mind. He knew to fear her. His instinct, immediate in his mind, sensed her power. It craved her power. The dog wished to worship and to prove. And so he followed her, further and further from his hungry sleeping master, still lit by fire. No rustling and barking or whimpering of guarding dog would rouse that man again. The dog followed her until in a glade he saw the pack surrounding. He realized his error at last, and the beautiful she-wolf in that moment watched as the once powerful dog startled about. It was in that moment her body moved. With teeth driving into neck, she took the massive dog down. Clamping through, his blood flowed, fell upon her white chest, dripped red from her white fur. The pack also was then upon the body of the dog, which, trapped by her strength exerted through teeth, writhed and remained alive for their feeding. Quickly his blood flowed, but only a drip fell to mark the snow, or else was taken by tongue. And from his wound she drank, and then he was still. The pack, satiated only enough for more, scavenged the body and took what they could in the cold. Though she-wolf drank but did not eat, and nor would the grim old wolf. He would feed upon the blood she would take, upon the death of the man, and upon her once she won him, her ultimate prize. For she had wooed the dog, won him, and killed him by guile, and it was she the pack followed, for what she brought them, that for which they would have fought. And the grizzled old wolf looked on as she approached, head low, blood-marked, shimmering in white silver. And she licked at his mouth as she had since a pup, and he tasted the prey blood on her breath. Again the old wolf watched from forest shadows. Through the trees the firelight glimmered over his lust. She prowled, fearless at its edges, watching the fear within, the fear of firelit man. And so the she-wolf, with pack watching, her edging movements, circled close to the fire. The old wolf knew the man would defend with fire, and would not, like the dog, be lured into the cold. The pack had learned to avoid the burning fire, had yelped with pain when struck with ember thrown. But she did not yelp with pain. She had learned to dance to remain, and just once was she struck when he tricked her, and she was burned upon her face with a thrust. But still even then she stayed, watching, even sitting or lying at apparent ease to taunt his fatigue. And longer than others she remained after the distant sound of men was heard, the distant sound of the man's saviours climbing up into the valley. The hunt was lost. The firelit man at the last remained. He had known what it was to live a single night from death. One last time she looked at the sunken man, and then turned and loped off between the trees where the old wolf was waiting. The Shield Maiden went silent and watched the tender, who waited. Only his breath and the sound of the chapel music could be heard. The Shield Maiden continued. One wolf from the pack, a leftover from another, allowed for his strength in the hunt, would have had her for his own. He came to resent the silent understanding the she-wolf showed to the grizzled old. The young foreigner trusted that by avoiding the sight of that one remaining eye he could win her unchallenged. He had tried, had been met with teeth, but he was undaunted, or else he too would long have died. He knew his power, and he wanted her for his own. He wanted to prove himself worthy. He wished to impress with his power. He too forgot. He failed to see he was watched. He thought his challenge remained unknown. In time the foreigner's confidence grew, and in a hunt for a bull elk he fought with honour beside her. Where others fell away, crushed and broken, one caught upon livid antler and flung, he survived. He had weighted the animal's hind, just as she in a flash had taken the neck. But then she had given the prize, and the old wolf fed, and the usurper resented the honour that he deemed should be his. Yet he fed too, and stood by, and stronger still his guard would further drop. He would more openly challenge. He would woo her before the old wolf. He would be seen. He would now be strong enough, and then she would be his. And so he confronted her, and still she growled, and still she slashed with teeth, and still he persisted, thereby insulting her, and the affront was too great. The old wolf, watching, knew what the foreigner would do, for the foreigner had watched all along, and so when the old wolf lunged, the foreigner knew to guard his throat. With immediate speed he lifted above, so to come down upon the grizzled one's neck. But the old wolf, more cunning even than the she-wolf he loved, had not lunged for the neck, and immediately the challenger's hind leg was crushed and broken between teeth. The challenger snarled and growled, angry, limping, undefeated still, but the old wolf was upon him again, and with another snap, and with a jerking twist of teeth, another leg was broken. Again the old wolf, despite the bared teeth of his foe, moved too fast, and thrust upon the fallen neck unseen, and the challenger's spine was broken, and only then did he fall silent. The pack did not feed, and the dead was left to ravens, and the she-wolf licked at the old wolf's mouth, and he honoured her as he suffered her, and she gave herself to him in the woods that night. The Shield Maiden went silent and watched the tender before her. The tender remained silent but for his breath. The chapel music remained. Eventually the tender spoke. "You are the she-wolf." The Shield Maiden replied. The she-wolf had been raised by man, yet as a grown pup she had encountered the pack. She had heard its calls in the woods. She had lived beside fire, and yet thrilled at the desolate sound of the grim calls across snow and between mountains and trees. Her ears had listened, and then through the woods she had seen the source, the full-grown, the scarred, his power. He stood between the trees. His body called to her, her coat raised to bristle, and yet she lowered her head, her teeth showed, and her ears forward then lay back, and then rose forward again. She spoke to him of interest, and thereby of spirit, and yet of instinctual submission as well. He was not like the dogs she knew. He remained in the shadow of trees, at a distance. He kept clear of the burning light of man's fire. He took his life from moonlight. She watched and almost imperceptibly whimpered, and in the quiet he approached. She stood as he approached and showed her full height, the length of her legs. She had not yet gained the full strength of her body, but to the old wolf her capacity for movement was already apparent. He could see what she was before she had become even half of that. She did not howl as he came closer. She was closer to him than to those with whom she had lived, those who were all she had known. She turned this way and that way with her body. She depicted the striving within her of two forces, one that guarded her spirit and one that wished to give it up. The force that guarded her spirit was that which stood tall, that which exhibited itself to the old wolf in her profile, which she showed him. And in the readiness of her tightly controlled pacing, just that slight, simple, alert movement was the seed of her agility. The force that wished to give up her spirit was that which recognized the old wolf. It was the part of her that betrayed her in its exhibition to the powerful form she saw. She wished him to see her. She wished him to see that she guarded her spirit. She wished him to challenge her, and when he would, then she would know. The fire flickered behind her. The dogs had not heard the wolf. His silence was beyond their hearing. His scent would never reach them. They did not have the blood. The wolf pup did have the blood. She was orphaned and taken young, almost newborn, adopted by man into their world, and that was what she knew, man and their servants, the dogs. It was not that she had not known the power of man and dog, and the hierarchy of that power, and she had learned her place in that structure. It was a structure of power, and even the greatest of dogs lowered their heads to man. And she, if not protected by man when found, would have known the jealousy of the dog, for they would have killed her. But man ever seeks to tame the wild. It is his power, and so, small and vulnerable, she was taken. When still with the capacity for compliance, they raised her, and soon the dogs learned that though young, she was fast, and her teeth were sharp. But as she grew, she recognized that force within her that sought to defend her spirit. The dogs had shown impudent interest, so she had learned to avoid their strength with her speed. She could move faster, more nimbly, and she learned no longer to fear them. Her movements entangled them in each other, checked them off each other, snarled them in the obstacles her environment provided. She was faster than them, and not only in body. She quickly learned as she grew how they fought amongst themselves and for her, and she learned how in their drive they became stupid, their attention became too focused for them to see. And yet to the men she was still but one of the dogs, expected to follow and to submit. Yet something within her rebelled. It was that same force that now sought to submit, and that same force that knew why before it had not. A construction existed in life with man. Her being, that she had felt growing, was weighed upon, and all that was weighed upon was now before her embodied, in the form between the trees, the form that approached, silent in soft white snow. The old wolf's eye never left her. He moved slowly. In the keenness of her sight she saw flashes of moon glinting from snow that fell to crest his back, to glisten upon the dark of his grey. She saw in him all that lacked in the dogs and in the men she knew. It was not something of flesh and bone. It was beyond even the fire of the settled. It was the movement itself, the immediacy. It was in the silence. It was in the perfect collaboration of mind, muscle, and bone. And it was in the movement's purpose. Before the being that approached her, even the men seemed small in her mind. It was for this she had unknowingly saved herself. It was for this she had unknowingly protected her spirit. It was because she had protected her spirit that he approached, and so she wished to give her spirit to him. The old wolf grew larger as he arrived, and she, lo, did not avoid as she was used to doing. Instead she remained. He stood taller and was twice her size. His giant head seemed as though it could swallow her, as if he could swallow all that she was, and a part of her willed that he would. And while her head remained low, her body straightened and took its form. Her muscles knew their blood, and when filled with blood they took their shape and showed their competence. The Shield Maiden, with eyes upon the tender, paused and then continued. I stood still as he inspected me. His breath drew me in as he passed, one silent footfall after another, one silent warm breath after another. I could now scent him, and I filled myself and realized it was the scent I clung to, that had reached me only when running in hunt, only when grasping my prey, only when I felt the true living blood of the earth upon my tongue. He was the hunt, the running hunt, the feeling of potential reached. The Shield Maiden paused again in a feeling of memory, and then continued. Not a movement did she make as his teeth raised to her neck. She could feel his breath upon her coat, upon the soft hairs that warmed her ear. Not a sound did he make as he split the leather that bound her. And then he turned from her. He turned back to the trees, and away from the camp he silently went, and behind him she followed. Never again would man know her submission. Never again would a dog presume without dying. So I joined the old wolf's pack, as a grown pup, not yet strong, but already fast, knowing and fierce. The tender spoke. Should that dog not have been rewarded for his recognition, rather than killed and eaten? The Shield Maiden spoke. That is for you to discern. The Shield Maiden waited as the tender considered. The tender spoke. Well, who are the figures at play? What do they represent? What may take account of apparent contradiction? The Shield Maiden spoke. Tell me. The tender spoke. The she-wolf, newborn, was taken and raised by man along with his dogs. Man knows fire, but not the wolf, which remains apart. Man provided the edge of fire and a pack of dogs. The dogs were provoked by the wild within the wolf pup. The dogs, a pack, did not fear the lone and small, and so she was beset and defended by their presence and proximity. Man had the power, and his dogs had strength, but neither held what the old wolf held. The old wolf shimmered in silver. He was the night feeding of soil. He was what allowed the will of the sun to rise so to be lit with dew. Man's control of her thus was an affront. The dog's hounding of her thus was an affront. Man was weak in the wild without the dog. He was all but deaf, had no access to the scent world. His senses already had dimmed. And his vulnerability made him nervous, and his worry made him cruel. Only through power did he maintain the pack. Through his power he made the dogs timid to him alone. But she knew there was more. She could feel man's fear in a way the dogs could not. She could see beyond his cruelty to that which it hid, his fundamental weakness, the blood that flowed in his soft-skinned neck. The dogs were his coat and claws. She scented for more. It remained in her blood to do so, and that was what called the old wolf, the call of her spirit for its kind, for she was alone, the foreigner in the world she knew. There are different orders of beings in this world. Man is one, and yet even among man there are orders of being. Just so amidst wolves, thereby you came to know the one-eyed wolf. He was more even than the foreigner, more than the wolf that survived alone where all others beside had died. And so the foreigner was killed. Even he was subject to presumption. Even he was not worthy of she who had already been chosen. The old wolf watched from afar because he was more than his physicality. He was more wraith than living being. He was the pack breath itself. He taught her to test the sinew of the living. He taught her to take down the weak. He taught her to temper the spirit of man. He knew that you, as pup adopted and raised, would know where fear should tread. Thereby you would avoid death. Thereby you could serve death by feeding death. Thereby the she-wolf became the Shield Maiden. The she-wolf serves death as a Shield Maiden serves life. By serving death the wolf learns duty, and thereby may serve life by choosing not the weak, but rather the strong. She took the dog that left its master's wounded side, yet to death the man was the prize, for man had taken for himself what else had been, and death thus coveted the life of man. And so the pack took the weak, and made more vulnerable the greater prize. But the greater prize grew in numbers, until even the wolf kept apart, and thereby all but starved. The lesser strives against the stronger. That is the nature of the expression of life, to strive against that which is greater. And that which is greater welcomes the striving, because then the gain is more. The old wolf proved himself to your spirit when he killed the wolf that presumed upon his throne. But the old wolf was the killer, and thereby honored the usurper. The would-be usurper was foreign-born. He brought his strength to the pack, but his will was not the pack will, it was his own. He knew the pack could die. He had lived alone and for himself, and that is why the old wolf allowed him. By challenging, the foreigner proved himself just as he killed himself. That is why the old wolf took him, and that is why his body was given to the ravens. The old wolf allowed that foreign form. By that wolf the she-wolf was tested. By that wolf the pack knew itself the better. The Shield Maiden, gleaming in fierce beauty, watched him and waited. The tender continued. So the foreign wolf was allowed for his spirit. He was brought within the pack, but only so long as he served the singular will of the pack. He challenged the rule, so he died and was given to the ravens. His flesh would serve their flesh as his spirit had served the pack spirit. The old one, the pack father, would have let him serve, but the foreigner had lived alone, and thereby was tainted with justified pride. The story itself is a shadow. The foreign wolf was your pack brother, separated from you and young, when the pack was dispersed and killed. The old wolf then too was pack father. His she-wolf was that which grew from the soil, that which had been taken by man. And so only 3 remained of what had been. The pups dispersed, devised to be lost, set to learn what the old wolf needed them to know. And that is how you knew him, why you licked at his mouth as you had since born. And just as the old wolf challenged you to love him above all, so too did he challenge the foreigner to match him. Thereby the two each earned their father's love. The story you told is a shadow because there is more. Will you tell what you omitted, or must I? The Shield Maiden, her eyes lit with the rising of waves in the morning sun, spoke. It is for you to see to challenge the story. The tender stood, taller than before, and spoke. I challenge the story. The Shield Maiden looked to him and replied, Man encroached and the den was upset. She paused, the tender watched her. She continued, Pack Father was hunting. Pack Mother remained but was drawn out. She ran, she drew the threat from us. She ran for days, and far from us our hunters chased. Eventually she could run no more and turned to fight but was weakened and so was killed. Time passed and we grew hungry, and one by one we died. Soon only 2 remained, my brother and I, alive by the frozen carcasses of our kind. But soon marrow was no longer to be found, and lean we became, alive but by the flicker of each other's warmth giving rise to a single flame. We grew to hunt by instinct. We were too young to be fast, and so we were called to guile. We learned to be still and to be silent while waiting. Together we learned to encircle and entrap, to entice and to threaten, to act together as one in the taking of our prey. Birds swept for one only to be taken by the other. Animals chased while we stole. That was what we learned from our mother and from man. And yet we were still but young, and there was little we could kill, and so we remained lean, and so we required, and so we knew each other's warmth. More hunters returned, and their quarry too was the wolf, to kill or to enslave to harness, so to breed with the chastened spirits of their dogs. When the hunters returned, they tracked and found the den, and they dug. We inside snarled, growled, and showed teeth to the voices outside. But then we were exposed. There was no retreat. We were the ones entrapped, and our hidden bed of furs knew the light of day. We could not fight the men, and they did not wish us dead. We were saved by our youth. We were determined by them to be theirs. Together in captivity we howled for our father, by instinct that he would hear, and together we snarled and injured all that would come close. And so we were separated and made weaker thereby, and then I knew no more of my brother until I saw in our father's eye his path. My brother, the stronger the sooner, escaped, and by way of stream and stone vanished from his pursuer's grasp, and so he was forgotten. I remained and came to know the ways of man. I came to know his dogs and what of the wolf they had lost, and I saw why they had given of themselves. Man had made a pact with fire. It was the enticement allotted to man. He would provide meat and protection in exchange for souls. And fire would warm and play. Fire would spread fear. Fire would entice the meek and scare the timid. Fire would draw all in to the slaughter. Man in this way was allied to something more than the wolf. Man was allied to fire. Fire became his tool. Fire kept him warm. Fire kept him safe. Fire guarded his life. 2 years I lived enchained, and I learned the dogs' ways. I learned they were their own pack, and how even their leader was slave to man. I learned that man was his own pack, how even one man might bow to another or be killed. I learned that he that struck first often won. My brother grew alone, he hunted alone, he avoided man. His taste was for the living blood, not for scraps from the plates of man. And so he lived, a member of no pack, and he grew strong and fast and silent, and so he lived until he would find his sister again. But in time the origin of the memory faded. The story had become a disconnected feeling, an emptiness, a knowledge of something that once was. That too is as it was for me. When my father found me, it was a feeling I knew, and a knowledge only of something now returned. The dogs, stupid and slow, eyes blinded by fire, never heard or saw him approach. He had waited for the wind to turn, and then he showed himself to me. He was twice and more the dogs in silhouette alone. The moon loved him above all else. She shone between the trees to find him. I saw him. I knew he was there. I had waited. My spirit yearned to spring and pounce against the collar and chain, to tear it from its bindings, so to run. But I, now a grown pup, knew, silently waited for the scent of his breath, that for which I yearned, and then silently I followed him into the wood. My father had already found my brother, had followed his scent far and wide over mountain and through valley and across river. He knew his son too followed a scent. Once he found it by instinct alone, it was my own. and it was on the outskirts of man's camp he slunk when he was found. I was within that camp, and it was there my father saw my brother prowling, waiting, ravenous for the blood of dog and man. My brother, true to his nature, did not recognize his father, only his father's strength, only his father's acceptance where all others had shunned. And so, prideful and alone, yet aware that by this other he might challenge man himself, and the scent he knew would be his again. And so he became his father's spirit, to overcome the blinding light of the fire, and closer he came, silent as was his custom, so to survive. It was in our father's light I saw him, the light that had kept him alive, the light of the moon on stone and snow. He knew his father's ways. In silence I knew his presence, and so I followed. It was by our father's blood that we bided our time, knowing our danger we became strong. Never again did we sleep alone, never again did we not know the other's warmth, never again would we be separate, thereby we would survive. Others joined in time, and a new pack formed to run and call, to hunt elk and bear, to spread the circle wide, to follow the ways we had learned. But man was the prize, and the dogs stood between, so we learned to weaken the dogs, to make man susceptible. All he would have would be his fire. We approached them at the end of their chains. We would injure the outliers, then retreat into the darkness of the wood. And those dogs, no longer useful to man, would be left for dead, and the wolves would feed, and man would carry on evermore alone. Our captors were our prize. We would weaken his pack, and then we would feed. And when it was time, when all that was left was his fire, then they would know. Across that desolate expanse the two men travelled with their dogs, and their trail was of the blood of dogs. Never was a wolf seen on which to fire. When there was but one dog left, one of those men struck out for us. He would become the hunter. He fired but one shot before he died. The shot missed, too fast for the wolves, too agile. He moved to aim, but the wolf was on his neck, and his measly blood ran as the last of his fire went out. There was then but the one man and dog. We could have set about them, but I knew another way. We would hunt until the end. And so I drew out the last, who had tried to have me. I brought him out by guile, and thereby the man, cruel with his fire, was left to sleep alone. The man had that night. I waited beside that fire, watching him. He spent that night with death's eyes upon him, and barely a flame to his fire. And when the voices came, the pack did disperse into the trees, all but myself and my brother, who stood nearby. And I waited as the man called out. I waited until the men had heard the man, until their sleds could be seen. I waited until I heard the first warning shot of fire. And then the man's neck was mine, and his blood flowed, and his spine broke, and he fell limp upon the smouldering remains of his life. And before the second shot could hit the tree, my brother and I were gone, and the pack joined, and the hunt started again. The dog was not killed and eaten that night. He lived to see what he had served. He joined the pack, and he was strong, the strongest of the dogs that had been. But it was he who offended again. He brought his memory of man to bear. He sought to usurp. He sought to be pack father, as if he was still among the dogs. Only then was he killed, the corrupted remainder of that world, allowed for spirit, killed for presumption. Yet it is true that he was given to the ravens. The Valkyrie paused, and then said, "Do you understand the dog?" The tender responded, "The dog is not the offender. The dog was taught. He was man's servant. His spirit was bold but dangerous. He was a true servant of his way. Just as the body reflects the mind, the pack reflects the pack father, and that seed is deep. Thus he would have made the pack as he made the dogs he ruled, as he himself had been ruled by man. That was the instinct arisen. He could be seduced to join, but tainted ambition would rule, just as the seed rules all, and the pack would be tainted and lost, just as it had been before. So that was his test, to see what he would value and to see what he would allow to rule. He passed one test and yet failed the second, but he acted always according to his law, and that was deep in him. It was all that was left of the Old One's seed, planted long ago in ancestors whose will remained in the sinew of the dog's deepest will, the will to test and the will to rule. But for the Old One that would not be enough, and that is why you gave the elk to your brother, for it he that with you bore the Old One's spirit. It was he that loosed you from chain. It was he who never forgot that it was your warmth that he had ever remembered. He bore the scars of battle, the marks of understanding, cut into him from the beginning, from the first bird that clawed with talon when he missed his first mark. But for you he quickly learned, and so you lived, and by him the pack grew, and the elk was taken down, and the pack became strong. The tender stopped speaking and faced the Valkyrie. The Valkyrie, in fierce, light-bearing sympathy, spoke. For every wolf pack there is a dog that seeks to join, and for every dog pack there is a wolf that seeks to join. Each in its way threatens the pack. One may weaken the pack and is suffered or shunned, and the other is feared and secretly despised. We followed the men with their dogs. Not all were killed. 7 dogs were in that pack. All but the first and last were taken for food. The last was given his tests, and he died with the second. He proved unable to pass. But the first dog was one I knew from my time with man. He was capable but not cruel. He was strong but was quiet within the pack. Like me, he bided his time. Unlike me, he was not so hated. He seemed enough as the others, but there was something different. He was not whipped, for he was careful. The other dogs recognized he took a space of his own. He was among them, but not entirely of them. He did not fully recognize the lead of the last dog we took. He did not directly offend the role, but he did not support its holder. I saw this when I myself was chained, when I watched those dogs and saw the channels of influence that ran among them. He was proud, but he was silent. He had learned to be quiet. When his ground was encroached, he would snarl, but not so far as to offend. The simple fact that he did not follow the leader separated him. All the dogs knew it. They could sense he wasn't one of them. He would put weight to the harness so that they all could eat, but he had little to do with the dogs beyond that. That dog was the first we loosed, and he joined the pack. He passed the second test. He bowed before the Old One. It was not that he could not lower his head. It was that he chose, and he knew the cruel leading dog of the pack was insufficient. I was awake when One Eye came to me and loosed my chain, and that dog was watching. He gave no alarm, just watched. And I saw him in one glance back as I entered the darkness of trees. I saw him raise his snow-laden head from his hollow and watch me go. That was why he was the first. That is why he was allowed. It is because he was aware. He heard what the other dogs did not hear. It was the very next night he was taken from that camp, taken into the woods, away from the fire and the whip. The men called for him. The dogs sniffed at his hollow. They followed the tracks as far as the shallow broad of the river. But there, where the snow had been, swept the moor with wind, the tracks ended and the scent was lost. All assumed he would be dead. He had been tricked by lean wolves. He had been taken, and he would be eaten, but he was not. I took that dog. I approached the woodland from the open stone of the mountain side, and we left by the water of the river. The dog was quiet in his snowy hollow. No other dogs were raised from their rest, but he knew he was waiting. I could see his ears and his eyes, and a hint of steam that rose with his breath as he sought the scent that was not yet there. He was half-wolf. His own wolf father had taken his northern mother in the cold woods beside a settlement of man. He had a different way in his blood. Men had prized him for his strength, for his resilience, for his silent duty. But it was another duty he dreamed of, a duty that felt different to him. He yearned for what he saw in the she-wolf, but still he had been silent as he looked on. He did not seek to protect her, which she proved to do for herself. Except once, when the lead dog bullied and the she-wolf, chained, was beset and might have been undone. And so with shoulder he unbalanced the lead dog and allowed the she-wolf to gain with teeth an exposed flank. And the lead dog retreated from her, never knew from where that shoulder came, never knew what had shifted his course. Down the shallows of the river we went, a distance before we found Stone again on the far side and then urged on to the pack. He followed. I did not entice. He followed as a pup follows its mother, and when we reached the pack, he did not challenge. He lowered his head and allowed the wolves, trusted the wolves to know him. And by that they did, and so he was allowed. That dog chose the wolf, and so he became the wolf. He remembered his father through manifestation in muscle and mind, and he remembered his mother in myself, the form of his mother, as he knew her, powerful, proud, and protective, yet given to the wolf. In my brother he saw his unknown father, the epitome of what was missing from the leading dog of the pack and from the men. He was not younger than my brother and I, and yet he saw us as ancient. He saw spirit age in our coats, in our movement, and in our eyes. As representations of our lineage, we were the age of our lineage. We bore the spirit age, not the age of body alone. And so he was young. He bore the age of his mind, which stood between. He felt his spirit, but it remained bound to his body. In mountains beside river and stream, his body soon would grow old, and as it grew old, it became leaner, faster, and more powerful still. He became the wolf. His mind became quieter even than it was, but he bore another aspect uncommon to the wolf. He bore the pack mind even more strongly than the wolves. There was a gentleness in his strength. He did not take the pack as granted. He knew what was less, and so sought ever for more. He ran as hard, but he also came closer. His mother's warmth was brought to the pack. She had been raised in a different world of man, not the cruel wilderness her pup came to know. She knew the fire of the cabin. She tended children about that fire. They were her charge. Fierce in consideration of their safety, she was trusted and loved by man. The man-child is vulnerable for longer than the wolf pup. The wolf mother does not know the tending that dog mothers knew. It was as much in her as the mountains were within his father. Their son was the combination, the epitome of those instincts. Thus was his spirit formed. Thus his humility and expectation forged. He knew the lead dog's weakness. It was the same weakness that was in all the dogs. Together they were strong in body, but their minds were weak and their spirits shallow. Under man their extension was constrained. Man required little of them, their strength, their fear, and sometimes their flesh. It was their fear that fueled their ferocity, not their strength. They were right to fear, right to protect, but they understood little. The wolf dog we took understood more, and so, with the opportunity, he embraced the fullness of his being and became the wolf. It was he who killed the lead dog, not my brother. It was his to take his own, to redress the wrongs of his corrupted kind. He looked to my brother upon the offence, and my brother gave him his eye, and the duty was done, and the dog lay dead. The Valkyrie watched the man, and then asked, "Do you understand the life of the wolf dog?" The man, his head low, replied, "I understand. I am the wolf dog. My father, the wolf, was shunned. My mother, descendant of wolves, tended children by fire." The Valkyrie replied, "If the wolf dog had remained, and if he had spoken, would the dog pack have heard, and would they have allowed him to live?" The tender replied, "They would have killed him long before ever they heard." The Valkyrie spoke, "What did the wolf dog lose?" The tender replied, "The wolf dog gave up all he knew, his life, to become the wolf, to gain what he remembered, the life he had all but forgotten." The Valkyrie spoke, "What did the wolf dog gain?" The tender replied, "He saw in the she-wolf all that had been lost. She awoke the past in him. He saw in her the age of his past. He saw the definition of the present." The Valkyrie spoke, "What defined the present?" The tender replied, "Limitation and control of expectation defined the present. It was the shackle man employed. Man ruled through imposition. All that existed was his present will. Fire allowed him that luxury. Beyond the safety of the fire was darkness. By that his constrained senses, dulled and deformed, fixated on his given will. He devised the very blinders he wore. To the man, the present disregards the past and the future. It is the pursuit of a dislocated feeling. The feeling is sought and so is never known. In the present, expectations may be controlled, and by that all may be enslaved. And so it is thought a virtue to think only of the present. In the present there is no room for question. Life arises as it arises, and must be accepted. Parameters constrict as necessary. Man forges his path with parameters. He considers his memory to be great. He writes and reads to remember, no longer are stories told. His stories can be thousands of years old. He takes pride. He forgets that the memory of the wolf knows millions of years within a glance. He forgets that the past is written in his muscle and bone, in the fabric of his mind, in the fabric of man himself. He forgets that it was written in the life of the wood. He cut the wood, and what was written was lost to function as mere beams and boards. He thinks he remembers because it was once written. He collects the books but has never known the old life. He sees what he knows of the wood and presumes. He lives in the present. He does not consider what the life of the wood was before it was cut. It is his way, his own boldness, but its value is dependent on what it serves, whether the present or all time. Man's dog learns man's way. That is why the dog presumed. That is why the wolf dog considered and knew the import of death. The wolf dog gave himself to death's cause, to the pack's cause, and by that he lived, where previously enchained he had not. Man, with no concept of death's reign, presumed upon it, sought their gold, and wiped clear the land of death's right. The Shield Maiden spoke. Speak to me of your return. The wolf dog spoke. My return was embodied in the course of my life. My return was to the father I never knew, and to the lives of ancestors. My return was to the knowing of more than the present. It was my returning to the soil through serving the soil, through serving death. I lived in the haze of isolated concern. We were hungry. We did not gain our food. I was one of many. If we spoke, then we were whipped. But before that I had known a different world. I grew before the fire as a pup, alongside the children of man. The cabin was in the woods of the north. Snow lay on the ground for much of the year. The trees there were white of trunk. My mother was the guardian of a man and 2 women in that broad expanse that I would come to know. There they hunted and farmed. And there they would raise their family, for one of the women grew large. 2 pulses my mother heard, and 2 children would be born. As a woman grew, my mother ventured into the woods. An instinct had arisen in her, a need to protect arose, and so she waited. Her mate heard, no dog but a one-eyed wolf, and my mother was taken in the winter that night, and I was born early in spring. It was the time when green first shows to contrast against the remaining snow lying in shade of rocks and trees. 3 strong pups were sired by that wolf of our mother. One was black as night, one like our mother was white as snow, and I bore silver. Then, soon after I first saw light, 2 children of man were born and given to my mother to raise. We grew with them. Our mother was our protector. The man-children, a boy and a girl, one dark, one fair, new-born, slept amidst pups before the flickering fire. They did not cry. Amidst softest new winter coats they were warm, and fed from our mother's teat. Quickly they were proved strong. Watched over, we 5 came to know the world outside. While the man and woman sowed seed, we rolled and fell in the meadow grass. Spring rose with our eyes. We watched life grow as we grew. All reached from nothing to the light, up to the warmth of the sun. Scents in newborn noses were strong. Colours were bright. Sounds were startling and new. The boy and girl grew amidst the offspring of wolf. 3 suns passed before my brother Black was given to the boy, and my sister White was given to the girl, and I was taken by the woman. She was the sister of the pack mother, the aunt of my mother, and so I had known her since I was born. It was not strange to travel with her, but it was strange not to return, and I pined for the warmth of lost pack. But she held me close, and I was strong, and my duty was now to her. With her I saw again the world I knew to expand. Then I learned the benefit of play with brother and sister in woods, for whereas the woods held threat, it was not equal to what I would find. The world of man was tight and fraught, and nowhere was the fire as warm as I had known. It was then I learned to be silent and to watch. There was no one else to watch, no giant white to watch over us all, no pack master to rule, and so then I was brought to fight. Alone against dogs in a camp, they startled my mistress with unchecked teeth, and I, the son of my father, took their lives. It was in defence, and so my mistress went unpunished at first, for she became ill from that bite, and untold miles from home she died. I was taken by a passing dog-master, whose pack was short ahead. For the first time enchained, I learned a life I had never known. It was the life of a dog pack, the life of the whip, the life of the harness, chain, and collar. I learned to be careful. It was not the life I knew. My ways held no credit. My ways were exploited, and thereby I was robbed of my goodwill. The trust that was established was mean and precarious, reliant only on usefulness in the most immediate sense. When the dogs fell, they were shot, and yet they had never lived unchained. Their lives were forfeit from birth. They were forfeit in the quest for gold, in the quest wherein no light shines that is not from the gleam of gold. It is a cruel quest. There is no giving, there is no benefit. All who take part are enslaved to a cause for which there is no end. No end but death, and not the dignified death that those who have lived may know, but the undignified death of those who have been cheated. I learned to keep apart, to keep quiet. I had tried the alternatives, but they were dismissed, seen as weakness, as evidence that I would be ensnared. To accept a corrupted way fit nothing within my instinct, not the warmth of mother and cabin, nor the freedom of father and the open wood. But it was my lot to be there, and so I lived subject to that way, and I learned how to compromise so to survive my allotted duty. The silence within was the expression of my difference, and rather than turn to discover, the others merely followed the lead dog. The lead dog was strong, ambitious, and as cruel as the men that ruled us. He represented, most among the dogs, the will of man. They favored him because, like a lead slave, he would enforce their will. They were the gods, and that is how the dog saw them. I could not be trusted by him because I did not follow his way. I was impervious to his will, and simply pulling in harness was not enough. And I could not be trusted by the pack because any dog that approached me would be chastened by the lead dog's fear. I found the balance to survive. I forgot that I was dying. I was living in the present, and the past and the future were dimming from my eyes. What was present was governed by parameters set by others. What was forgotten was anything that might cause the parameters to be questioned. Thus the past was forgotten. Thus the expectation of the cabin was forgotten. Thus the expectation of the wild hunt was forgotten. Scraps of meat were thrown, and the men laughed in watching the scrabble of hunger. They speculated without feeling for wounds. But those men, hence that lead dog, were presumptuous. They were presumptuous in thinking they could have you. They brought the wild into the camp with a mind to taming. You were their prize, the true wild, within their control. But you were not tamed, and the lead dog could not have you, though older and bigger and stronger. He was stupid and slow against you, barely yet grown. He was relentless. You were even more than me, thus you could not be allowed. But you were all I needed to remember. In you I saw my father's spirit. You seemed a sister, known to me through an ancient strand of feeling. Where I became silent and reserved, careful, even timid, you snarled and tore, immediately strived against chain, and never succumbed at all. You lived the past, the entirety of your past. It was active in your every cell, in your every expression, in your every movement. The past was the future for you. Millions of years lived and extended for as long as the forests and mountains remained. The breadth of your consideration could not be diminished. You tore down the parameters imposed as soon as they appeared. That was the difference between you and I. You expressed my own memory. You were the awakening that caused my present to expand. That is why I watched you from afar. Even I had been silenced, but though silenced, I was never conquered. Thus I knew you. It was one day when I could stay silent no longer, and so I acted. It was the day your beauty was accosted and for once was put to threat. Then an impulse arose that would not be silenced. I did not think and consider. Invisible and in silence I accosted and deflected. It was enough. Your ground was found again, and the wound was given. From then it was for me to wait, for from then I knew. You were she that I loved. You were the spirit I had forgotten, and one day in your eyes I saw that you recognized me and would take me for your own. In the night, when all else slept their fitful sleep, I felt a presence in the wood. There was no sound, no scent, but I knew it was there for you. Apart from others, I made no alert. Apart from others, I would have fought for your freedom. Apart from others, my silence was given. I watched as a great old wolf appeared. Grizzled and scarred, his one remaining eye gleamed like moonlit snow. He was grey like me, but also silver, with black legs and white face. I saw in him my lost siblings and my mother and my unknown father combined. He was the source of your spirit, embodied in its purest form. He was twice what you were. I couldn't have made a sound. I might have dreamed that scene in my snow den, but I lay covered but for eyes and ears, and I saw, and it was more real than any day. It was more real than the whip, more real than fatigue, more real than starvation, more real even than the men with their fire. I watched you. I watched your attraction. I watched your muscles ripple in a harness constructed of your own will alone. A dog would have leapt, pined, barked, and strove against chain in a frenzy of expression, but you stood in silence and waited. There was no expression necessary, for he knew what you were, and yet you did express. Through your rippling stillness you said everything. You grew in those moments. You became yourself the more. You presented yourself to him with head low, and thus he allowed you. Only once he arrived did you stand at your full height, still tiny to him, yet proud and strong and willful in service of ancient duty. Only once he circled you, only once he let you send his breath, did you lick at his mouth and thus give your honor as his. No man with whip and no dog with tooth could match what you served. They, impetuous, presumptuous, strove against time itself. The wolf showed his love for you in those long moments, and your body became alive and alert, longer and stronger and ever more beautiful. It seemed he glanced once at your neck. I never saw the movement that caused the leather to split and fall to the ground. It was as if that which would confine his daughter had no strength. His presence alone broke that confining band. Freed, your body grew again, more graceful still, the extent of your being released to realize a state it was born to know. I wondered when the revenge would come, for that wolf seemed able to tear through the entire camp at once. But it did not come. The wolf remained silent. He loped into the snowy night, glistening wood. He never looked back. All this I saw without moving an ear. I saw you look at me from the edge of firelight, and from then on I knew, and I waited. In the morning the dogs were mustered to scent man's lost prize. I ran with them, but knew you would not be found. From then on I knew that, henceforth, your terms would rule, and it would not be in the day that you would be seen. It would be at night, in the reflection of fire in your eyes, in the darkness of blood on your coat, their blood, not yours. You appeared to me as the old wolf had appeared to you. I felt you in the night, your presence, I felt the warmth of your breath. Again, none other stirred. Such was your silent grace. Your scent never reached the camp. Your paws made no sound in the snow. You stood tall but walked low. I glimpsed you in a stream of moon as your shadow fell beside you, silent as a star passing across sky. Never had I been so close, never so removed from others, never without the jealous eyes of the pack to see. The pack slept and my loving lust arose. I had watched you, and so I knew you would be my guide. With head low and with head high, I gave myself to you. You took my scent upon the pallet of your mind. You walked around me as I stood. I felt you know me. I felt the caress of your breath. And like your father who took the chain from you, so you took the chain from me. It fell unsounding into the muffling snow. I did not look back, as you had. No more were there to be found. The dogs knew their sleeping leader, who dreamt of the sleeping men. He was strong, he was himself impetuous. He followed, but dreamt of their blood. He dreamt that he himself would carry the whip. So I did not look back. I followed your lithe form through the trees, first slow and then fast through the cold water of river. The men had lost two, not just their prize, but also one reliable and strong, and the pack would not find the missing. The lead dog knew responsibility, that whips would fall sharper, and that he would mimic the cruelty of his imperfect gods. The pack would learn, they copied their gods, the pack followed the lead followed the men followed on their own failure. I loved you as we passed across landscape, creating with floating stride the wind that would sweep through the valleys between mountains. I loved you as I watched your coat shimmer in the night air beneath silver light. I loved you for you were more than me. I loved you because you saw your father in me and trusted I would reach to meet the will that you in the depth of your blood required. Ages of forest and creature passed before my eyes, the passage of glacier and bird, the passage of herd and storm. My stride gained in distance, my legs reached across valley and mountain, we leapt first stream and then river. The stream that made your breath became the stars, your coat became the trees that blanketed the wide-ranging earth. The crest of your back became the ranges that separated and connected worlds, your eyes were the moon at night and the sun in day. Your mind knew pack and herd, wolf and elk. You maintained the soil, became the life that forever had fed both forest and all within. It was for that I reached. It was to serve you. It was to be of your pack. It was to counter that which would threaten your way. That was the basis of my joining your pack. That was the basis of my life through death. Never again did I sleep alone. It was never the way of wolf to take all at once. The herd must be culled but not killed. The forest must be maintained. And so we culled, but we culled those that would kill. The herd was of man and dog, those that with whip sought gold. The camp was surrounded. The dogs were allowed their frenzy. One wolf would run and snap and injure, one by one, the dogs. The men were left with their bleeding means, with their weak and fallen. One by one, night after night, the dogs fell. The men were left with their building terror. Once in panic they fired and missed and killed one of their own. Soon they ceased to travel by day. They became too weak. Soon, haunted so, they ceased to sleep at night. Soon they could no longer conquer sleep. They became too tired. Soon there was but one left with the lead dog that survived. The lead dog would be wooed and won, given one last chance to live. I felt the question within, but trusted. I knew he was tainted. I knew he must be put down. I knew he would offend. I knew the dog in him would remember his masters. But ever fair were undaunted wolves, and so the dog was brought within the fold. So ever I watched, but no longer were you chained. The dog would offend, despite a hint of better will. He was held by the experience of his life, and it called him, and he imposed himself upon you. Quickly thrown off, he persisted. This time I did not hide. I remembered the weakening of elk. This time as he rose, I entered low. His hind leg was broken, yet his nature showed through, growling and snapping, his displaced memory of me returning. He, like the men who trained him, who would curse and swear to their end, would ever fail to acknowledge his fault. And so he died, and so his body was given to One-Eye's ravens, and so the last man was left alone with his quickly dying fire. That night, in return, you gave yourself to me in the forest, that your pups within would grow knowing of the death of that last man. The pack no longer needed to hide. It ringed the clearing at the final flicker of warmth. You and I entered, you alone approached. The man swung fire as he had in camp, but unchained he had no chance. And when he tired, you sat and watched his diminishing eyes. He shouted, but no sound reached you, just the wind that passed through the trees to tease embers, to chill unfortified bone. The sun rose beneath the eastern horizon. Its light bled into the sky. The man's hope rose. He straightened his aching body, but his mind was struggling. With the first rays of the sun itself, he heard the voices of man and called out in presumptuous triumph. But there were no men to come. It was his dream. He remained alone, and yet with his imagined triumph came the she-wolf, leaping with rays of new day to his neck. With a fast snap of the wolf jaw, the man's neck bled. By her strength he fell upon the embers of his fire. He screamed and shouted and cursed. But he could not touch her when he rose, burned and charred and bleeding, and she retreated, and he threw at her what he could find. Still he followed, as she feigned nearing defeat, as she arose in him his vengeful bile. He allowed himself his vain confidence. Still he followed, lunging towards as she feinted her way ever closer to the river. He swore to drown her himself for his power. When the river was there, and he high upon a rock, threatening with a branch, she in 2 leaps knocked him to fall. He fell into the rush. His gold-filled pockets bore him down. He sunk beneath, his blood given, the stolen gold returned. Silence descended, and then sound arose. The river received the light of sun, which lit its once lost gold, and only then did the forest live again. The Shield Maiden, fierce and radiant, spoke. Now you know of your birth through death, and that your offspring resides in the forest that lived again. That which was yours shows in the prints of your tracks, shows in the way that you went. Those prints are cast in the clay beside the streams from which you drank. All that you were has been lost, but the path you took remains. Others walk it now. The pack still roams, wider now than when man still lived to follow his gold. The man, standing tall with lowered head, spoke. And what of me now? Will I join you again? You became the Valkyrie. Will you again, despite my blood, take me? The Valkyrie reached down from her horse and swept the man, a child in her arms, up to her breast. Into storming cloud they rode, her spear pointed to the northern sky. Her sisters rode alongside, on battle steeds of their own. Lit by flashing light, they carried the fallen.